Hello and welcome to this section on object-oriented programming basics. Let's look at what you will learn in this section. After completing this section, you will be able to explain about the OOP concept and most importantly, what is the purpose of OOP, why you should learn this, and if someone asks you why are you learning this course, then you should explain this in your own words. You will learn what is class, objects, properties and methods in this section. Then you'll learn how to define, means how to write a class, object, properties and methods. Then you'll understand the OOPS concepts using some real life examples. Then you'll write your own class, object, properties and methods. And then you'll work with exercises, interview question, resources and practical test using OOPS so that you can understand these concepts well. Well, these are the lectures we will cover in this section. Okay, so let's jump into this lecture now. Hello and welcome to the lecture on what is object-oriented programming. Let's look at what objectives you will learn in this lecture. After completing this lecture, you will be able to explain what is OOP, what is the difference between procedural language and an OOP programming style, and how to start thinking in OOPs. This will set you a mindset of how you're going to write your programs using OOP concepts. Okay. So this is what we're going to learn in this lecture. So let's understand what is OOP. The word OOP actually is a full form of object-oriented programming. So when someone say OOP or OOPS, it's not the OOPS, but typically it's OOP, which actually is a full form of object-oriented and programming. So these three words, object-oriented and programming. So object is basically a real-life object. Anything in the world could be an object, right? Computer is an object, car is an object, user is an object. Anything that you can think of as an entity could be an object. So you write your programming style in terms of an object, right? That's basically oriented. The way you write your program in terms of an object is called as object-oriented programming. Instead of writing that program directly, you relate your program to some object first, right? And then you try to define that object using your program. We'll look into details of how we're going to do that, but that's the full form of an OOP. Object-based programming, object-oriented programming. The way you write your program, you think from an object, right? And what is object? Object could be anything that you can think of, right? Everything in the world is an object. Anything that you can define as an object. Your computer object, a car object, phone object, a database could be an object. Anything that you can define into an entity, something that is related to a group. So OOP stands for object-oriented programming. That is a full form, and please remember that. OOP is a programming pattern or a style. So remember this definition. If someone asks you what is OOP, instead of start explaining what is OOP, you can give this one-liner definition. OOP is a programming pattern or a style. OOP is basically a programming pattern or a style you can choose to follow, right? Using which you can create some small group of code based on a real life objects. Like I told you, objects could be like a car, user, bank, cat, dog, anything, right? You have to define an object first, then you have to group your program into that object, and then you start using that in your programming style. Remember that OOP is a programming pattern or a style. And the main purpose of OOP is to create reusable code. You're going to see how OOP will benefit the reusability of the code. But for now, you have to understand the main purpose of OOP is to create reusable code. Well, if someone asks you why are you writing in OOP, the simple and easiest answer you can give is because of the reusable code. When you try to understand the OOP concept, this is very, very clear to you. The reusability of your code is enhanced just because you follow the OOPS concept. Okay. So remember this, OOP stands for object-oriented programming. So what OOPs bring to your code? What is the benefit of using this programming style or a programming pattern? Well, OOPs bring modularity to your code. When I say modularity, it's basically a components, right? A small components. You create a chunk of code which is related back to some object, and that brings a beautiful modularity to your code. Your code will be split into small modules or small components which can be easily reused in different applications. That's basically the benefit that OOPs bring to your code. And when I say modularity, which actually means you split your program. Let's say you have 1000 lines of program that you typically write. You split your program into smaller individual modules that can be separated and that can be recombined. And how you're going to do it is all about how do you write and understand the OOPs concept. When you write your program using OOPs concept, this is what you're mentally thinking. You're thinking of how do I write my program into simple, smaller individual modules. You write them in a separate individual modules, and then you try to combine them and then work with those components. And when you're writing program using OOP style, then you need to start thinking in modularity or objects. That's what I was trying to explain you. You have to start thinking, how do I create an object, and then how do I write my program to define an object. Okay, so let's move on. Well, this is a very classic example I want to give you. Let's say if you have to write a PHP program to define 3 car types and its color. You have to display a car type and its color. So this is the program that you have to write in PHP, and whatever style that you know till now without OOPs, you might be defining 3 car variables and then define the car variable colors, and then you try to display them, right? And this is how you might be writing your program. On the right hand side you have, let's say, 3 cars, Ferrari, BMW and Hyundai. So on the left hand side you have your PHP program. So in order to write a program to define 3 car types and its color, you will define 3 variables of car type, you will define 3 variables for car color, you will assign the values and then you display them. And this is called as procedural language, wherein you are not thinking of any objects. You're just writing your program with some variables and you're just trying to assign some value to a variable and you're displaying them, right? There's no programming style or there's no programming pattern in this. And this style is called as procedural programming style. Till now, if you have been writing this, then OOPs is basically will help you to simplify your code, and it will help you to increase the reusability of the code and help you understand how to write a modular coding. Okay, so let's understand that. Well, this is an example of how your code can be converted into an OOPs programming style. I'm not going details of what is class and all those things, but just try to compare the program that you used to write in procedural, and if you have to write the same program in the OOPs programming style, you basically create something called as group of reusable code. The group of reusable code, you only define the variable once, the name of the car and the name of the color, and then you try to assign that value and reuse that group of code. You don't reassign to each of the variables, but you create something called as a group of a reusable code. Well, this is the concept of OOP, where you first define an object. So this group of reusable code is called as car, and you're actually imagining a car and then you're trying to assign some details of the car into one group of code, and then we're gonna assign that data to that specific group of code. Okay, we're going to learn all the concepts of the OOP, but try to imagine if you're writing a procedural language, how the OOPs concept will change your programming style. Okay, so let's move on. So what is OOP? Okay, so let's understand the definition of it. OOP stands for Object Oriented Programming. That is the full form of the OOP, and you're thinking in objects. Just now you were in procedural style, you were not thinking of any object, but when it comes to OOPs, you will start thinking about a car object, right? And it is a programming style. How are you going to change your programming style to achieve reusability and modularity in your code? OOPs bring modularity to your code, means you try to group your code and try to reuse it. And you think and convert your code into real life objects and use it. That's how the OOPs concepts work. You don't start writing your program, you take a step back and you think first, how do I convert my code into a real life object and then try to reuse it? Okay, we'll look into some of the examples so that it's very clear of what is OOPs and what is the benefit that OOPs bring to your programming style. Well, here's a comparison between procedural versus OOPs. On the left hand side, I have the procedural coding, wherein you define the variables, you assign the value, you print them. There's no concept behind it. There's no object behind it. You don't know if I give the variable name as $A, $B, $C, and you don't even know what it is all about, right? You haven't defined any concept, or there's no programming style in this procedural language. You're just thinking about a variable, where to save my data and how do I display them. Wherein in the OOPs, basically you are defining something called as a class, right? You're defining a cars class. Then you're thinking of, okay, I am dealing with cars now, so I have to convert my code into something called as cars, and then I try to reuse them, right? And if you just glance through the code here, you have a cars class. We haven't discussed about what is class, but think about an object, right? Car is an object which has a name and a color, and then you're just trying to define it once, and then you're trying to reuse them by just passing the data into it, and then you're trying to print them. Forget about what is the notation, what is this all about, but think from a difference between procedural versus OOP. How you are changing your coding style from writing just variables and assigning values, than creating something called as an object, and then try to reuse that object in a different manner by passing different values to it. Okay, so what is the difference between procedural versus OOP? In procedural, you are actually thinking in how to write the code from top to bottom by defining the variable and print them. Well, this is what we think in procedural. If you're writing procedural for years, this is what you and me has been doing, right? We start from top of the page, we go to bottom of the page, and whenever we are hit with a variable, we define them, we store the value, we move on. We want an array, we define an array, we store the value, we move on. If you want to print something, we write echo statements, we move on. We are not thinking about a pattern. We are not thinking about how can I organize them. If you organize them into smaller components, then you can reuse them. But in procedural, it's not like that. You just keep writing the code from top to bottom. But in OOP, you are thinking in how to define into reusable components first. You have to define first what components you need in a program, and then you use it. So that's basically a bottom-up approach. You don't first write your program. You conceptually define it first into a component, then you try to reuse them. Okay? In procedural, you define variables, you define functions, you define logical flow of the program, and there's a sequential flow from top to bottom. You start from the top, you finish up in the bottom, right? That's the procedural style you and me has been following from years. From now onwards, when we are learning about OOPs, we are actually thinking of a component. We are not writing a program, we are not writing variables, we are not writing functions. We are not thinking about logical flow of the program from start to bottom. We are thinking of a component. We are converting a program into something called as an object. And we are converting and we're thinking what is this object could be related to. That's the thinking of a component, and then we define that component. Then we'll define if that is a component, it could be a car, cat, dog, database, file operations, string operations, it could be an API, whatever it is, but what is object, variables and functions could be in that component, right? If it's a database, then definitely the variable inside a database could be database connection. If it is a file, then it's a handler of a file, right? If it's a phone, then it's a phone name, phone color, phone price. That could be the variables. Then the functions is send message, make a call. Could be an functions that operate on that component. Okay, you have to start thinking in object oriented programming from here onwards. And then in the last, once you define that component, the major benefit that you're gonna get is you can reuse it. Then each component can share its benefit by extending it, and then you can share the reusability function from each other. Okay, so that's the benefit between procedural versus OOP. So let's start thinking in objects. I want you to have a very clear mindset before starting this course that you have to start thinking in objects. Forget your procedural style that you have been thinking so long. Stop thinking about how do I define variables, what should my variable name, what are my methods, and how should I put my sequential flow. Shall I put this in this file or should I put in that file? That is basically thinking in procedural. I want you to make a paradigm shift in how you think about your program. You have to start thinking in objects, right? When I say objects, it could be a car object, it could be a phone object, it could be a video object, could be a database, could be a file and folders, could be a user, could be mail, and could be, download option. So you have to think about, when you write a program, what are you trying to write about? What are you trying to define that feature? Maybe you're trying to define a feature of a video, right? You're writing a video player. Then you have to think that you're writing a video object. If you're connecting a database, it's a database object. If you're writing a mail, then that's basically a mail object. If you're downloading something, then that downloading is a feature and you're writing a download object, right? Start thinking in objects. That's the mindset you should have when you learn OOPs. Because once you know, okay, I have to write in object, then all the concepts of OOP will help you to define that object and help you to write better object-oriented programming, and help you also to understand how can you convert your procedural language into the object-oriented programming language. Okay, so start thinking in objects, and I want you to give this a serious thought of how do I start thinking in OOP. Don't just skip it over and say, okay, let's look at what are the OOPs concepts first. If you really want to learn OOPs and change your concept, thinking in OOPs is really must and very important to know. First thing you need to understand is everything in the world can be defined as an object. Don't come to a conclusion that, oh, this cannot be an object, so we cannot write OOPs for this particular feature. Everything in the world can be defined as an object. Start thinking and organize your code into smaller components and real life objects. This is the step one before you actually open up the editor and start typing. You have to take a step back in OOPs and you have to sit down and say, okay, let me organize my code logically. How do I write into components and how do I define them into a real life objects? We will start learning OOPs concept and how to write OOP in the upcoming sections. Right, that's a bunch of concepts available to understand it, but you have to start thinking in OOPs. That's the main concept I want you to understand. Okay, and first thing from here onwards I want you to do is stop thinking in procedures, variables and functions. Stop thinking in variables and functions. Even we will not call it as a variable here onwards. Even when you define a variable, that word variable, we will not use it. When you define a function, we will not call it as a function. That's because the naming convention in the OOPs for variable and functions are different. In OOPs, variables are called as properties and functions are called as methods. So we will completely change our lingo in how do we talk in OOPs, and how also we will start thinking in OOPs, right? Start thinking in objects. Okay, so I hope it's very clear what the mindset should be and what is OOP. OOP stands for Object Oriented Programming and it's basically a programming style. And what is the purpose? It brings reusability and modularity to your code. You start defining into small components so that you can reuse them and you can extend the feature of that component by other components. Also, you have to do a mindset shift from procedural language to an object oriented language, wherein you have to understand what benefits you're gonna get in moving away from procedural and moving to an object-oriented programming. Well, that's all about what is OOP, and I hope you get a pretty much idea of what is OOP and how you're gonna start organizing your code into an object. Okay, so let's do a quick summary of what you should be able to understand by now. You should be able to explain what is object-oriented programming in your own words. You should be able to understand what is the difference between a procedural language and an OOP programming style. And I want you to start thinking in OOPs. Okay, from now onwards, if you see something, a program or something, try to convert that into an object and see what is this object and what features of that program can be moved into an object. You might not have learned how to define it, but you can start thinking in OOP. Okay, so that's all this lecture on what is OOP. Let's try to implement some of the concepts that we have seen here. Let's try to understand and start writing in OOPs. Okay, that's all for this and this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on what is class. Let's understand what is class, how do you define it, and what is the purpose of it. So in this lecture, we will cover two topics. First is we'll explain what is class, we'll understand the class definition. Then we'll understand how to start organizing things in classes. Okay, so let's move on and look into these things. Well, in the previous lecture, we started thinking in objects. We said everything that we define in our programming style, we first have to define it as an object. Okay, so we talked about car object, phone object, video object, database, then your files and folders, users, mail, and download. So anything that you are writing a program, you have to first define them into objects. Then what is classes? Right, class is basically a blueprint of an object. Well, class is a specification or a definition of an object, where an object is basically something you can start using it. Class is just a specification, like a documentation of that object. Okay, so let's understand what is the definition of a class. Class is a logical grouping of code with variables and functions specific to that object. So the first step is you identify an object. Let's say you're writing about a video player. So you say, okay, I'm going to create a video player object. So you start grouping your code and into variables and functions into that class, and you create a class with variables and functions operating on that object, and that object could be a video object or database object or a user object. So if you're doing a database object, then when you define a class for the database, the variables could be the connection of that database, and the function is to do a query, insert the records, delete the records, those type of functions specific to that object. We're still calling it as variable and functions. We have a separate lecture on it where we're going to understand why variables are called as properties and why functions are called as methods, and how to properly use them. But as of now, we will continue to use variable and functions till we reach to that lecture. Okay, so for the definition of a class, class is a blueprint of an object, which is a logical grouping of your code with variables and functions specific to that object. The main purpose of the class is to organize your code into individual components. So if you're writing a program, then you have to split your program into components, and then you have to say what component it is, what object it is. And when you write your class, you basically arrange all your variables and functions specific to that component or an object. Okay, so let's look into more details of how to define it and how to organize it. Imagine you're trying to define a car, right? Car is an object. Then what is a class? Class is basically a specification. It's a documentation, or it could be a definition of what are the things required to make a car. So it's something like a blueprint where you define all the components of a car. And what is an object? Object is basically the physical representation, or the active version or the implemented version of that specification. Okay, so something which is not real but a specification is basically called as class. Objects are real and can be used. You cannot use the class directly. You have to create an object of a class to use its variables and functions. Okay, so let's move on. So organizing in class, basically when you think about objects, right, you have to first organize them into class. The first step is to define a class, then you have to convert them into an object and use it. So if you have a car object, as you're discussing about thinking in objects, the car object can be defined as a car class, then phone object can be defined as a phone class, and then video class, database class, files class, user class, email class, and downloads class. So you'll start creating these classes, and each class basically holds variables and functions that is operating on that specific object. If you define about the car will have its own variables and functions. The phone will have its own variables and function. The function of phone could be different from a function from a video. The function of a phone is to send message, make a call. The function of a video could be to play a video, load a video, all this buffering a video. So that features of that component will be written in that function in the specific classes. Okay, so you have to start thinking in object, and you have to start organizing your program into classes. When I say organize your program into classes, means organizing your piece of code which has variables and functions into that class. Okay, so let's organize a car class. So let's say you have a car class. Now you have to organize your program into this car class. So typically you have variables and functions. So variable of a car could be name and a color, and functions of that car could be set the name, set the color, and then display the name and the color. Well, without the object oriented programming, you could have just defined the variables and print them. But now you started thinking in objects. You have to define a class first, which is a specification or a blueprint of an object where you organize your code into variables and functions specific to that car. So whatever the variables that is required for the car class to operate, you will define that in the class. So let's look at how to organize in classes. You have to identify how you can organize your code into objects, example users, database, files, and posts. That is the first step. Then you start grouping them into classes, because you cannot start defining an object. An object is defined from a class. So first step is to define the classes, and each class has variables and functions into related individual objects. As we've seen previously, car has its own variable and functions operating on that specific class. Similarly, you define each classes for each objects that you're thinking to organize your code. And one class will hold many variables and functions, but is logically represent to that object. Which means when you define users, you don't define database variable and functions inside the users. The user variable and functions will operate logically in that specific object. Okay, let's look one more example of how to define a class. So think how to organize. If you're doing an users class, well, take a second and think, if you're doing a users class, how are you going to organize your variable and functions, and what are the variables that you need for a users class? Think for a second. Okay, so for the variables, you have name and age that is specific to that users. Then you have functions like set the name, set the age, display the name and age. So here you're not combining other object details into this object. This class only defines variables and functions specific to that class. Okay, if it's users, then you're talking only about name and age and some of the details of that users, and functions are basically the methods operating on that variables or specific to that users class. Okay, that's how you have to organize your code into classes. So let's do a quick recap. Class is a blueprint of an object. So class is basically a specification, a definition or documentation of how you're going to organize your code into variables and functions. An object is something you create from a class and use it. Classes help you to organize the variable and functions to individual components, and one class described about one object's variable and function. This is very important to understand. You have to have this concept of one class is one object and all the variables and functions are specific to that object. Well, you have to have this mindset very clear. When you define one class, that class should represent one object and all the variables and functions should be specific to that class. Okay, never mix and match between variables and functions related to two different classes into one class. Okay, so let's summarize this. So you have to start organizing in classes. Previously, we start thinking in objects. Now you have to start organizing your code into classes. You have to have this mindset, because without this mindset of organizing things into classes and objects, you won't be able to write much in OOPs. So when you start thinking of OOPs, you have to organize in classes. So the first step is to identify classes in your program. So whatever program that you have written so far, you might be having a calculator program, or you might be having a file operation program, or basically a data that has been converted into CSV or any web page that you have. Well, the first step is to identify classes. You have to see your program and say, what is the class that I will be creating for this kind of program? What is the logical grouping of my code? How many classes I have to create to organize my code, and what are the objects that is required part of this code? Okay, so start defining the classes. You may not be defining by writing it, but start defining mentally. It's a specification, so you have to understand what are the classes you're actually writing it. So take a program that you have and start defining that into classes. Okay, remember this one thing always in your mind, that classes are specifications and are not real. You're not using classes to print or to call a method or basically to assign a value. Classes are specification, they're just definitions or documentations. Well, objects are real, so you create an object of a class and then you start using the variables and methods defined inside the classes. So let's do a quick summary of what you have learned. So by now you should explain what is class, what is the purpose of the class, and how to organize your program into classes. You have to understand this concept very clear. You should know how to think in objects, and you should know what is classes and how to organize your program into classes. Well, that's all for this lecture on what is class, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome to the lecture on how to define a class. So we have understood what is OOP and what is a class and how to think in objects and how to organize in classes. This is what we have seen so far. So let's start defining a class and understand how to define a concept of an object into a class. And class is nothing but a blueprint of an object. So before we look into the details of how to write the code, let's do some logistics here. So I have a course which is a PHP basics course. So if you are new to PHP, then I highly recommend you take this ultimate PHP basics for absolute beginners course. It is a 16 hours course, so you will be learning completely about PHP, and there's a couple of things I want you to bring your attention is setting up the PHP environment. Here we have discussed in detail what are the editors you can use, how to check whether the software is installed or not, how to download and install PHP on Windows and Mac, and then there's a couple of things that you need to know, like how to start working with strings, arrays, functions, and files, and obviously with all the PHP language basics like variables, expressions, operators, and also the control structures. So you should know all these basics before you start writing the code. So I'll quickly show you what is a PHP setup that I have and what software I'm using. Most of the setup that I have is already documented in this course, so it's highly recommend you watch this course if you want to have the similar setup in your system. Okay, so for PHP I'm using amps, and that's been installed in d:\amps and www. So I'll be creating a folder here, and then I'll be start accessing those files from localhost amps. So make sure you have amps installed, and I'm running on PHP 7, and MySQL is a database that I'm using. Okay, and how it's been configured, it's already documented here, how to download amps and install on Windows and Mac. And the editor that I'm using is called as Sublime, and this is where I will be typing the code. Okay, again, if you're new to PHP and you don't understand how these things is been configured, there's a free course that you can take where you understand how this PHP is configured and how you can download the softwares. Okay, so I'll close this, and I hope you have gone through all these things, or else you have a proper installation of PHP using XAMPP or MAMP or WAMP, which is where you can write your PHP program and execute it. Okay, so I'll close this, and we'll be start using amps for our executing the PHP code. Okay, so first thing we have to understand is how to define a class. So let's take an example of a car class that we have seen previously, and let's define a class. Let's not do anything fancy about it. Let's go step by step, one concept at a time. Okay, so let's start defining the class. So before that, I want you to show you the setup that I'm using it here. I have amps. In www folder, I'll create a folder called OOP, and I will save all my files in this. So once I do lecture 1, so maybe I'll say class, and all the files that we create in this section will be stored under the class folder. Okay, and if you have to access it from here, you can go to class, go to OOP, search class, and then we will try to access the files that we are creating here. Okay, so let's save this file. I'm saying Control S. I pressed Control S here, so it will ask me where to save the file. So I'll save it in the amps folder, www, OOP, and class. Okay, and I'm gonna call it as car.php. Okay, and I'm gonna paste some of the notes that I want you to remember. So here's the notes. Let's go through one by one, then we'll start creating a class. Okay, the first thing that you have to remember is the class name. Okay, when you write a class, the first letter should always start with capital letters. Well, it's a naming convention that is good to follow, and your first letter should always starts with capital letter. So if you're writing car, database, file, video, the first letter should be always capital letter. The file name should match with class name, which is easy to follow. So if you see the file here, car.php, definitely you see there's a caps here, so you might be make a first guesses, maybe a car class is inside this file. It's also a very good notation when you write a file, the file name should match with the class name. And always remember, one file should have one class. It's not a mandatory requirement. You can have multiple classes in one file. Just for the good practice, right, you should have one file in one class. You can have multiple classes in one file as well. Okay, and then there's a class is a keyword that is used to define a class. What is a class? Class is a specification of an object. So when you're thinking of an object of car, you have to first define it. What is your class? Which is nothing but the specification, right? Class is open and close with the flower brackets like this, and all the methods and properties like variables and functions you have to define inside the class. Okay, so let's define the class first. So the keyword to start defining the class is called as class, and then the name of the class name. The name of the class name should match the file name. The file name is car.php and the class name is car. Okay, we will not add .php here, we just say it's a class car. Okay, now you can have functions and variables inside this. There's nothing fancy about writing functions. If you know how to write a function, you can just write a function like this. Okay, and then you can write your echo statements here. You can say hello from Clark class, and you will add an end of line. Okay, so that's how you define a car class. Okay, you have a car name of a class, and basically it's matching with the file name, and you have a function called hello class which is printing some value. Okay, so let's execute this and see what happens. Okay, so I'm going to open a command line, then I'm going to navigate to this folder and make sure you have PHP installed, right? I'm using PHP 7, and if it's installed then you should be able to execute the PHP file. So I'll say php car.php. okay, and there's no output here, right? Obviously we haven't called the function, so there will not be any output here, but just to remember that class is a specification. Okay, class, anything that you write here will not be executed. Okay, you have to create an object of it to execute it. We haven't discussed about how to create an object, but I want you to remember that class basically won't give you an output, and you don't write echo statements outside the functions. You don't write like this. Okay, this is a wrong way of writing a class. You don't write echo statements outside the functions. The only thing that you have inside a class are two things. One is a variable, another is a function. Okay, anything else apart from it will error it out. Okay, don't write anything outside the functions. Everything that you write, you want to write an echo statement, you want to do some calculation, do always inside a function. So class can have two things. One is a variable, one is a function. Okay, so this is how you define a car class. Okay, so let's look at how do you define a database class. I'm not gonna jump into topics because we haven't discussed what is an object and how to define an object. So when we go into that lecture, when we understand what is object, how to define an object from a class, then we will start to enhance this program and then try to use the object to call this function. Okay, but for now let's keep the discussion only to classes because that's what we have seen so far, and then we will start creating another class just to understand how to define a class. Okay, so I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call it database.php, and if you look at the naming convention that I'm trying to use it here, you'll pretty much understand how you have to also start using this naming convention to write a class. Now I'm defining a class database, and you can see the first letter is D and the file name and class name matches with the same name. Okay, and you have to start thinking in objects and start organizing your code into databases. So in class you can define two things, one is variable and one is function. So for database, what could be the variables? To define a variable, you have to mention public, and then you will say DB connection. One variable you require, maybe you require a string to hold the maybe a records. Okay, so this is the way how you define a variable. Okay, we're going to talk about what is this public keyword, and you have private and protected. We're going to discuss about all those things, but as of now, when you define a variable, just mention public it here. Okay, so this is how you define a variable. Then we'll define some functions. What could be the functions that you can have in a database? Just think for a second. If you have to write a class for a database, what could be the functions that you could have? Okay, to save time, I'm going to copy paste some of the functions. Well, there could be function where you can open the connection to the database. There could be function to fetch a record which accepts an ID, and based on that ID, that record is fetched. Maybe you have a method that is called as insert records, that is, you pass the data and that data is been inserted into the database. And you have an update records where you just pass in the ID and then you update that record. Then you have delete records where you can pass the ID and delete the records. Maybe you can just say, okay, for this ID, this is the new data, right? You can even say that. So this is basically how you are organizing your code in classes. Okay, I'm not going details of how and what are the concepts, how to define connecting to a database, but take a step back. Okay, forget about the implementation, but think in objects. Think in how you're going to organize your code into classes. So what we have done is we have defined a database class. We have defined a variable that is useful for that database to operate, and we have defined methods that's basically work as an operation on that specific databases. Okay, and you see we haven't combined car and database into one class. We could say car database, and then we could just combine all the methods, database, variables and functions into one. This is the concept of OOP, where you can think, you're thinking in object. Database is one object, so all the variables and functions to that database in one class. For car, there is one method, so you're defining that method specific to that class. Okay, so class is a keyword that is used to define a class, and once you define a class and when you run this program, it doesn't print anything. Obviously, even though you have these functions and you have echo statements, your class cannot be called by itself. You need an object to call that function, because class is just a specification of an object. You have to create an object of a class to call that methods. As of now, you should know how to create a class and what are the rules of the class that we have seen, right? You have to understand what are the naming conventions and good practice to create a class. Okay, this should be enough for you to understand how to write and define a class. Okay, so let's run the database as well. Okay, there's no output because anyway we are not printing anything and we are not creating an object to call the class. Okay, so this is how you create a class with some variables and with some functions. Okay, so that's all for this lecture on how to define a class, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on property and methods. In this section, you will understand how you should call a variable and a function inside a class. Okay, so that's what we're going to discuss in this lecture. We'll explain what is property and methods. Okay, so let's take a step back and understand how to define a car. Then we'll try to understand what are the property and the methods. To define a car, let's say you have a Ferrari car and you want to define the elements and the action of the car. That's basically the features of a car, right? What are the elements of the car? The car could have color, it could have name, it could have, the tire, the shape of it. So there will be an elements of a car, that's a parts of the car. Then you have the action of the car. The action of the car could be start, stop, apply brakes and all those things. Okay, so let's look at what are the elements. Elements could be name, color, size, model, type, and the car elements. It could be parts of a car, right? And the action of a car could be start the car, accelerate, brake, and etc. Right? So there are two things always assigned to an object. One is nothing but the car element, or basically elements of that object, and next is the function of that object. That could be an action of that object. In terms of the Ferrari car example, you have car elements and car actions. Car elements is name, color, and action of the car could be start the car, accelerate, and brake. Okay, this is how you define a car. Okay, so let's take this concept and understand what is property and methods. So what are properties? So here I have a class car. Just now we have defined a car class, where class is the keyword and then you have a name of the class. In this you have defined some of the variables in it, and these variables are inside the class are called as properties. They are properties because it defines the car. It is the elements of the car. That's why you call it as properties, not as variables. Variables is just variable to store something into a memory. But when it comes to a concept of classes, you're thinking in classes, you're thinking in objects. And when you think of object, you're thinking of properties and elements, right? You're not thinking about memory of, you're not thinking about variables, you're not thinking about storing the data, what type of data you're storing. You're thinking about properties. Okay? You're taking a step back and organized your code into an object and start thinking about for that object. If it's a car, what are the properties of a car? If it's a database, what are the properties? If it's a video, what could be the property? If it's a file operation, what is a property? The file operation needs a file name, right? The location of the file and what is the file name it is and where it has to operate that. Maybe it's an OS, you have a different way of operating it. Maybe it's a Windows, you different way of executing that command. So you're thinking in terms of properties, right? That's basically elements of an object. The $name is basically called as property of a class. That's how you read it. You don't say $name variable. That's a wrong notation and wrong way of speaking in OOPS. If you have understand OOPS correctly, then you should say $name is a property of car class. This is how you should speak in terms of OOPS. Okay, so people will understand when you're saying $name is a property of a car class, you have said that car is an object and one of the feature of that car is basically the name of the car. And when you write a class, when you're writing a specification in your own words, you basically convert that into this definition. $name is a property of car class. Okay, and $color is a property of car class. Okay, so these are properties. So from here onwards, we will not call it as variable. Okay, it is basically the property of that class. Okay, let's look at methods. For that same car, you can have methods. You can have start car, increase speed, decrease speed, and stop car. These are basically the actions of that car. The car could have actions, the files could have actions. That we have seen database also. Database has an action. Insert the records, update the records, delete the records. Those are the actions of the database. Okay, and those are definitely the functions using which you execute the code. And in OOPS, they are called as methods. So functions inside the class are called as methods. They are the action that is operating on that object. Okay, so start car is a method of car class. This is how you define it. You don't say this. You don't say start car is basically a function of a car class. You don't say function anymore, even though you define it as the function keyword, but you call it as a method because you're speaking in objects. Similarly, stop car is basically a method of a car class. Okay, so let's look at together what are property and methods. So $name is basically a property of a car class and start car is a method of a car class. Properties help to define elements of a class. Okay, this is what we have seen previously. And methods help to perform some action in that class. The methods will use those properties to store the data or basically to help in perform that action. Well, that's the purpose of naming it as properties and methods. They are basically elements and action of that class. Okay, so what are property and methods? If it's a database class that you have seen it previously, we just created, The DB connection and records are basically the variables, but we call it as properties. The functions that we have created are called as methods. So remember this here on, whenever you write a class, when you explain to your friends or somebody else, try to call them at properties, try to call them as methods. You will be tempted to say variables and functions because that's the mindset of a procedural language. But when you're talking about class, you should never say it as a variable. You should say it as a property. It makes more sense because it's an element of that car. It's not a variable of a car, right? It's basically a property or an element of a car. That's why you have to name it correctly. Okay, so you're learning a language here, a separate concept of OOPs, wherein you have a new lingo to speak. Okay, so remember, variables are property and functions are methods. Okay, so let's do a quick summary of what you have learned for now. You have explained what is a property and methods, and next section we're going to start writing some of the examples of property and methods. Okay, so that's all for this lecture on property and methods, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on defining properties. So let's do a quick example and understand how to define property and methods. So I'm going to call it a folder as property. Then we're going to move into that folder. So let's create one class here and we'll call it hello class. Okay, and I'm going to drag it into Sublime. Okay, and then we'll start defining a property and a method for a class. So what we're going to do is we're going to define a class. Then we're going to define one property that is called as content as properties of class. Then we're going to define a method called as hello in the class. Okay, so let's define the class keyword class, and then the class name, which should match with your file name. And now you define your property using the keyword called public. You can understand why we are writing public in the next section, but as of now just remember to write public there. Then you'll write a function called hello and we'll just print something. Okay, so a couple of things here. First is the content is called as properties and hello is called as method. And when you define a variable, you have to use this public and define that variable, and then you have a function that's basically called as method inside the hello class. So how do you call $content? $content is nothing but a property of a class, and hello is basically a method of a class. So this is how you basically try to speak in terms of OOPs. Let's create one more class just to give you a good idea of how the property and methods has been used, so that you get used to it. Okay, so I'll create one more class for post.php. And I'm going to call it post. I'm going to define two properties of it. The post could have properties. Post could be, an article. So if you have to think of post, what are the properties and methods of it? Think for a second, or you can just pause this video and try to do your own example and see what you come up with, because it's all about thinking in objects and organizing in classes. So you have to think by yourself how you're gonna organize your code when you're writing about posts, and what are the properties that you're gonna have and what are the methods you're gonna have inside that class. Obviously the post will have post content. It's not mandatory that you should have only this name of an property. You can have anything as you want it, how you want to organize your program. And maybe you want to have a post ID, right? There could be a couple of methods. I'm going to copy paste it here. So here are the methods called add post, update post, delete post, and fetch post. This is different from the database. Inside these methods, maybe you are already calling a database library. That's basically the database class. So there will be some methods connected to post. Okay, you won't mix and match, but you might be using the database component inside post component. We're going to look into this concept called inheritance, wherein you can reuse the component methods into another component. Means you can extend another class into this class, but that's a concept we're going to look further into this section. But as of now, remember that if you're defining a class, methods basically operates on that specific class, and if you have properties, that property will relate to that specific class. Okay, so this will give you a very good example of how to define properties and methods specific to that class. Well, this will help you to understand how you should organize your code into classes. Okay, these are the two examples, hello class and post. You can create your own examples and try out to see. Take a program and try to convert into a class, and if you execute this, obviously there's no echo statements and we are not creating an object of it, so there's no output from it, but for the sake of executing, we can still execute this. Okay, it's just to check the syntax is correct or not. So this is important to understand. When you write a class doesn't get executed because this is just a think like a documentation, which is just a specification. It doesn't execute anything. Okay, so these are the two examples, and just to understand what is property and methods. Well, that's all on this lecture on how to define properties and methods, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on what is object. Till now we have seen what is OOP's concept, what is classes, and how to define classes, what are property and methods, and how to define it. We have written some code and we have executed it, but there was no output. So now we have to create a real life object, means an object from your class. That's what we're going to see in this lecture. So in this lecture, we're going to explain what is objects in OOPs, and then we'll start writing objects for your classes. So what are objects? Objects are used to access properties and method of a class. So we have seen previously when we defined our car class, we have defined our post class. When you executed that code, there's nothing output because class doesn't get execute. Class is just a documentation. Whenever the PHP interpreter sees the class, is just skip the class, right? It doesn't go inside the class. The way we execute the methods inside the class is via the object. So you have to define an object of a class, and via the object you basically call and access the property or methods of a class. Okay, so you need to create an object of a class and then start accessing the property and call the method of that class using that object. Okay, so objects are also called as instance of a class. Well, this is again a change in the lingo. So when you're saying object of a class, you have to say instance of a class. Objects are also called as instance of a class. You can create unlimited object for a single class. Means you have a car class, you can create n number of objects, and you can objects basically you can say car 1, car 2, car 3, car. You can have n number of instance of an object, and each object is independent of another object. When you create an instance of a class, that specific instance will hold the variable and data specific to that object. Okay, we're going to look into all those things. As of now, remember that to access a class methods and properties, you need an object. And as we discussed, each object properties are unique to that specific instance of a class. An example could be you have a car 1 object of a car class, and you have a property called name inside that object, and you have assigned some value. Then you define car 2 with some different property of that name. Then the two car have those properties independent to each other. Okay, and then they are specific to that object and independent of each other. We're going to look into all those details now. So how to create an object? So let's say you have a car class with a property called $name, and you have a method called say hello. How do you create an instance? You have to create an instance with this notation. You have to a $car1. That's basically the name of your object. Then you have a keyword called new. Then you have to define the class name and then the open parenthesis and close parenthesis, and then end with a semicolon. So car1 is basically called as object of a car class, or car1 is called as an instance of a car. Okay, this is how you define and create an object. So now using car1 you can access the property and you can access the methods. Okay, car1 is an object of a car class. Car1 is also an instance of a car class. Okay, how do you access the properties? If you want to access the property of a car class, you have to do via the objects. And now just now you have defined car1 as an object. So using that object you can access the property of that class. So how you access it? There's a notation like this which you use it for arrays. Is the same notation. You have a dash and a greater than symbol, and then you specify the property, and that property doesn't have a dollar sign here. Remember that there's only dollar sign on the starting, there's no dollar sign afterwards, and you access that property and you assign that value to it. Okay, it's as simple as assigning a value to a variable. Here you basically use an object to access that property and assign that value to a property. Okay, so this is a symbol, dash and greater than, the same symbol to access the array elements, is the same symbol that is used to access the property of a class. Okay, how do you call the method? Again the same notation will be used. You use the object and the notation hyphen greater than symbol, then you call the method of that class, and once you call it, then that method will get executed. Okay, so this is the way you basically call a method of a car class. So by now you should be able to understand what is object, what is the purpose of an object, how to define an object, how to access the property of an class via the object, and how to call the method of a class via the object. We're going to write a program to see all these details, but conceptually you should be able to understand this now. Okay, so that's all for this lecture on what is object, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on how to define objects. So let's define some object here. We'll call it as object, and we'll create a car class here. And I'm going to open it in the Sublime. So let's define the car class. We use the class keyword to define the class, and the name first letter should be uppercase and it should match with your file name. Okay, let's define two properties of it. The property should be defined with public keyword. We'll say name, color. Okay, let's have a method in it, call it say hello, and we will print some value. Well, we have seen till here how to define a car class with some properties and methods. Let's understand how to create an object and how to access these properties and methods. So we can say car1 is equal to new car. Okay, so using this object, now you can access properties and methods. So we'll set the properties first. The name of the car is Ferrari and the color of that car is red. Now I want to call the method and say hello, and you can now say $car1, that's the name of the car is this color. Okay, so just have a look at how you basically write an object. The object creation is here. This is basically assigning the property a value. You must remember that you're not putting a dollar sign here, even though it's mentioned with dollar sign here. When you access the property, you don't have to mention $sign twice. You already mention it with the object. It will directly refer to the property name. And then when you call the method, you just have to call the method like how you call a method. But just difference is you will use the object. For that object, you are calling the method. Okay, so let's execute this. So let's go to object folder, and then we're going to execute the car class. So you see hello for car class, and then the value has been shown here. The value is basically you have assigned to that specific instance of a class. So this object actually holds Ferrari and red. You can actually do one more example of it, and you can create one more sample of it and call it another object car2. And you can see they both will be different, and you can say blue, and you have the same code just reused. So let's call it car2, and this is car2. Okay, so now you have two instances of a class, car1 and car2. Car1 is holding Ferrari red color and car2 is holding BMW blue color. Well, this is the power of the OOPs, wherein you can create n number of instances, n number of object of a class, and then you can start using by passing the whatever data you want to store in that object. Well, class is a combination of property and methods, and to access a class you create something called as objects, and via the objects you basically access the properties and methods of a class, and all the instances that you create are independent by itself. Okay, so that's an example of how to define an object and how to access a property via an object and how to call a method via that object. Okay, so that's all on this lecture of how to define an object, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on how to define methods with parameters. So let's create a real life example of a class with some real life example of how do you create a method and with parameters. For this we're going to do a file operation here. So you should know how to access a file, how to read a file, and basic operations with the file. And if you're not aware of it, you can take the free course where we deep dive into how to work with files. So I hope you have done that exercise and you know how to work with files, because here we're going to just look at the OOPs concept and we're not going to discuss about how to work with files. We're going to look at how to define that specific program in terms of OOPs concept. Okay, so I've created a files.php. Let's define a class called files. Let's define a method of a files class, and the operation of that file class will be to display a content. Okay, and the return type is boolean, and you're passing some variable to it that could be a file name. Okay, so we'll write the code here on how to display the content based on the file name, and you will understand how the class can be reused. Right, you pass in different file names, it just print out different files. Okay, and you'll understand how to create a class, how to access those methods via the object, how to create an object, and how to pass values to that methods. Okay, so I'm going to quickly write the code here, how to display the content, and then we're going to start creating the objects. So we have created a method called display content, which has a variable called result, which is true or false. If there's some problem in reading the file, you make it false and you return it. Okay, if everything is successful, it will print the content of that file. Okay, the method is called file get content, store it in a variable, and we'll print that variable. Okay, and it will return as a boolean variable. So let's define an object for this class. We'll say files1 is equal to new files. This is how you basically create the object of a class, and using this object you can call the method of that class. Okay, the method is called as display content. Now we'll pass in the file name. You'll say test.txt, and let's create this file. Okay, let's save this file. So the file is created and it will call this method. You can call this files and you can see the content of the file here now, right? You can see the file name and you can see the content of the file. The most beautiful thing about OOP is the reusability and the modularity of the code. That's what we discussed when we discussed about OOP's basic. So let's look at a very good example of OOPs that brings reusability to your code. Okay, a perfect example is just like this, right? You can choose to have one more file name, or you can choose to have another instance of it trying to read another file. Okay, you're not changing the actual code. Remember, you have just defined the class, you have the specification ready. Now you're just printing the objects, right? Like how they create the cars in the real world. They have a machine that is pre-coded with the specification. The machine just operate and just print out the objects, and that objects are basically cars. So it's the same concept. You have your specification already feeding, right? Now you are just printing the objects. That's basically the beauty of OOPs, wherein it brings the reusability to your code, right? And n number of times you can just use the same specification and you get the same output that is defined as per the specification. Okay, so for that you can create one more file called test1, and then you can get to display that content twice. Okay, so that's the beauty of writing in OOPs, wherein your code is being organized into classes, and then you create an instance of a class and then access the methods of a class via the instance, and then you can reuse your code as many times you want. So means the object can be created unlimited times. Okay, so this is how basically you can pass a parameter to a method inside the class, and this is how the OOPs brings reusability to your code as well. Okay, so that's all on this lecture on how to define methods with parameters, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on use case of an user class. So let's say you have to define a user class. So let's take an example of what are the concepts that we have learned, like what is class, what is object, what is property, and what is method, and how to start thinking in objects and organizing in classes. Let's implement all together and look at a use case, how you can implement those concepts. Okay, for this let me create a folder called use case for class, and we'll create a file here which is called as users.php. We'll open that in Sublime. And we'll start creating the class. Call it as users. And I'll define two methods in it. One is to fetch users, where you pass the ID. And another method maybe to delete that user. Okay, you can have any operations that you want, but it depends on you what you want to implement. So you pass the ID in it. Okay, and how you're gonna call the methods, right? You're gonna create the objects. So you can say user1, new users, open and close parenthesis. Now using this object you can actually call the method, right? You'll say fetch user. Now you can fetch like you're fetching from a database, right? And you don't have to really do anything fancy here, just recall the method n number of times. Maybe you want to delete the user, right? And how you're going to write this functionality is up to you, right? If you know how to connect to a database using PDO and then how to do that operation, you can think as two-step process. The user doesn't directly connect to a database because that is not the job of the users. The job of connecting to a database will be from a database class. Okay, the job of the user is to handle that user request, but the job of a database is to connect to a database. So if you're writing a user class, maybe you're trying to query, maybe you're trying to create an instance of a database. You can say $db is equal to new database, and then you might be calling its method to say, select query, and then maybe you can pass the ID into it, and maybe you're gonna pass the table name into it. Well, this database query is specific to that database, right? You can say, okay, this is my ID and this is my database, do this operation. Okay, you leave it to database to do that job. You don't do it in the users. You leave it that specific operation to database to do it. So database will have the code to make a query on that specific table and with specific ID. Okay, but from your user point of view, you need to fetch users, right? But you leave that job to a database to do that. This is how basically OOPs work. You think in components. User component does one operation of fetching the user, but it doesn't do the job of connecting to the database. Connecting to the database is the job of a database component or a database class, right? So you call that database class inside your users and you try to use it. You haven't learned how to access one class inside another class. That's a concept of inheritance, but I'm just giving you an idea of if you want to do an operation of user class, right? You can define methods that is specific to that users. You can define objects to call that operations, and then you can have different components doing different jobs, and then you can reuse them into your own components. This is your logical step, right? You will call the database, okay, query the database, okay, that's your first step. Then you will display the records. How you're gonna do it is up to you. Okay, and maybe you have a variable called result which is always false, and maybe after this the result will become true, and then you're returning that result. Okay, so as and when we go into this course, we will be implementing this code, right? We will try to understand how the relationship between two classes work. When you understand that concept of inheritance, then we'll implement and enhance this code for users to go connect to a database, and database will go actually connect to the physical database and fetch the records, pass it back to the users. Okay, but for now, logically understand how these things work and how you can write your program into classes. That's the main purpose of understanding this code. And you can still say echo deleting the records. So we are not doing the implementation here. We are trying to understand the OOPs concept here. We are doing a use case of a users class. Okay, so users class basically can have two methods, fetch users and delete users. and by just creating instance of it and passing that ID, you can actually write a method to do that specific operations. You can say query the database for ID. Okay, so you can see you can query the database and then you can delete the records. So now you have a way to organize your code. That's the most important thing I want you to start thinking, right? You have a way to organize your program now. Okay, if you're thinking about user class, this is how you organize your program, and this is how you basically write methods and call them. Okay, so that's an example and a use case of how do you write a users class. We'll do the implementation of these classes in the upcoming lectures where we understand more concepts of OOPs. Okay, so that's all for this lecture of how to do a use case of user class, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on project section. In this project, we'll create an employee class, and in this employee class, we will try to calculate the salary of an employee. Okay, we'll try to use some of the details like working hours per day of a employee, is hourly rate, and total leaves taken, and how many is the working days. And based on this information, we'll try to calculate the salary of that employee. And whatever the concepts that we have learned so far, how to create a class, how to create properties and methods, and also how to create an instance of a class, we'll reuse all these concepts and then we'll try to implement in the employee class. Okay, so let's do the project now. So we create a folder called project employee class, and then we'll create a file called employee.php, and then we'll open this file in the Sublime. Okay, so in this project we will try to calculate employee salary. Okay, and this employee salary will be based on how many working hours per day we have, what is the hourly rate, total leave taken, and the working days. So let's create the class. We call it as employee. Then we'll define some properties of an employee. Okay, we'll define his ID, could be an employee ID, the name of the employee, then we'll define the working hour per day, that is 8 hours per day, could be 8.5 or 9 hours per day. Then we have a property of defining hourly rate, that is $15. Then we'll have a property to store total leave taken. Then we have the working days. This is the working days per month. Okay, and then we'll write a function to get the salary amount of that particular employee. To get the salary amount, we have to pass how many days he has worked, right? And then we'll return a salary of that particular employee. Okay, the total days is the total working days that the employee has been worked, okay, in a month. So we're going to use a variable called this. We have a separate section on what is this variable called this, but for now this is a special variable which can be used to access class properties. Okay, the $this, we have a separate section. The next section is just to work on this $this. But for now, to understand what is $this basically refers to this class instance, and using $this you can actually access the class properties. You cannot directly access the property like this, even though the property is been defined here. To access this property of a class, you have to use something called as this, and this is basically an instance of this class, whatever the current instance is, and this is a keyword that you have to use this, and then using which you can access the class variables. Okay, so using this, now we can say the working days. We'll try to calculate the working days of an employee. So total days, how many days he has worked, minus the total leave taken. Okay, the total leave taken, we will try to add it when we create the object. So total working days, which is equal to total days minus his leaves. Okay, and then we'll calculate the salary now. To calculate the salary, we need to just multiply the working days with the working hours per day and multiplied by the hourly rate. Okay, and then we'll return the salary. Very simple and straightforward. There's nothing fancy here, but you have to understand one concept is this, which we'll cover in the next section, is the way to access your class properties. Okay, and it refers to an object of this instance. Whatever the object that you're referring to, based on that object, property values will be used in the calculation that you have written here. Okay, so now you have a class, employee class, which is representing with some ID, name, and how many hours per day he has, what is his hourly rate, total leave taken, and working days. Then we have calculated his salary. Okay, let's try to create employees and then we'll calculate their salary. Okay, so let's say we have an employee 1. Okay, this is how you create an instance of a class using the new keyword and then the class name with the closing with the parenthesis. And then now you can try to add the property of it. So the property of an employee 1 could be 101. Then you can add his name. It's a string, so you can add like his name, and then you have to pass in how many leave he has taken. Okay, you can even say that total leave taken in that month is 4. Okay, now you can calculate his salary. Okay, his salary is equal to, we'll call the method get salary amount, and then we'll pass how many is the working days. So 20 working days, and he has taken 4 leave, and that is ID and the name. So we'll get the salary based on whatever the parameters set in this class. Okay, and then we'll try to print that. So we'll say echo, we'll write an end line, that's a new line. We'll try to print all the property of the employee 1. So we'll say employee 1 name has worked for these many days and taken this is the total leave taken, so we'll say that is the leaves. Then we'll print his salary also. Because we have stored the salary, we can now use the salary. Okay, so this is how you basically create a class, define some properties. You can use this variable to access your class properties, and then you can write a function, and then with the instance of a class you can access all those properties and methods. Okay, you can create an employee 2. So now you can just replicate the code that you have and just change the instance of it. And you can call him with a different name now. This time you can see he has taken 2 leaves. Okay, and that should be enough for you to understand the concept here now. How to create a class, how to create methods, how to create properties, then how to create an instance, how to access the property from that object, how to call a method from that object, and how to access those properties. Okay, so let's execute this. Okay, so if you compare it with the code, so John Smith has worked for 16 days and taken 4 leaves, so the salary will be 1920 USD. And Jacob has worked for 18 days, taken 2 leaves, so his salary is 2160. So you see how easy it is to write your code in components. You have just written the core logic here with the properties that you require for that employee, and you have all the details to calculate his salary. And now we're just passing the data that is required for this class to operate. So what you have done is you have actually created an employee object. Okay, you have represented a real life example into a class. So instead of calculating this into a spreadsheet, you actually created an employee class, and then you have defined all the properties and methods required for that employee to operate. Well, this is how the OOPs work. You define a class, you correlate all the properties and the methods for that specific class, then you create an instance of it, and then you try to replicate that instance based on whatever data that you have, because you have employees, and for each employee the ID, name, and how many days he has worked and salary will be different. So you can just have to create the code for one time, that is the class, and every time you create an instance of it, you just pump up the different data into it. Okay, so this is how you can work through and create an employee class, and this is a perfect example to understand how OOPs work. Okay, well, I want you to try this example. Write a class, try to create some properties and methods, and try to access those properties, and then play around with it. How do you create your own concepts into an object? Okay, so that's all for this lecture on a project on employee salary. Then I'll see you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome to the exercise section. So I hope by now you should know how to write a class, how to define properties and methods, and how to create an instance of a class, how to access the properties and method using that object. Okay, with this we will create one more example, and we'll try to create a bank class. Okay, that's your first task. You have to create a class that is called as bank. Then you have to define the property of the bank class. You have to have 3 properties: account number, name of that user, and what is the balance amount that is there for that user in the bank. Then you need to have 3 methods: deposit amount, deduct amount, and check balance. So if someone says deposit amount, so add this amount to the balance. When someone says deduct amount, deduct this amount from the balance, and make sure you check whether the balance is less than 0 or less than this amount. If the balance is greater, then you try to deduct this amount from that balance. Then you will check the balance, you'll just print the balance with the account number. Okay, so you create an account for an user, means you will define a user with the user ID, with the account number and the name and this initial balance. Then you will call the methods by checking the balance, depositing the sum of the amount, and deducting some amount from his bank account. This is very a classic example of how can you implement your bank example into an OOP concept. Okay, if it's very difficult for you to initially do this exercise, or maybe it's too much for you to think through and write all these things, well, you can do 2 things. First, you can give a try, write whatever you know without seeing anything or referring back, so at least you get to know which area you don't know. When you do understand, you can go back and watch that video and give a try out by yourself. When you practice, you will understand. Write whatever way you know, just put some echo statements and then try to write it out. Then you'll understand what are the things that you cannot understand, what are the things you are lacking. Second approach will be, there will be a PHP material folder where you can just open up the material file, have a glance through it, close the file, and then do the exercise by yourself. Okay, so you can take any approach you want, but make sure you try this exercise. Without writing any program, watching the videos is useless. You're not going to learn anything out of this course unless you write this program by yourself. So I highly recommend you write the programs, get used to how to write OOPs, because for the next concepts you need to understand how these basics work. Okay, so make sure your basics are strong and you understand how to write a class, how to define properties, how to access them inside a method, and how to call these methods, and how to call the property from an object. For now, please try to do the exercise so that it help you to understand these concepts better. But you can pause this video and do the exercise. Okay, welcome back. So let's do this exercise. So I'm going to create a bank class here. So we have to create a class and call it as bank. Then we have to define three properties, that is the account number, name, balance, and initially we'll say balance is 0. Okay, we need to have three functions. One is deposit amount, deduct amount. You need to have check balance. This you need an input parameter. Okay, so first thing we need to do is deposit the amount. So you have to just add to this balance. Okay, so for this we'll use this keyword, and to this balance we will add the balance plus the amount. Okay, let's write the deduct amount. So deduct amount, you have to check whether the balance is not less than 0. So we'll say this balance, if the balance is less than equal to 0, then you can say no balance in the account, and you just print something and then you return from the program. Okay, and the next situation, if the balance is less than the amount, okay, then you can say the requested amount is greater than balance. So you cannot really withdraw the amount. Okay, and if none of these conditions are true, then you can safely deduct the amount. Okay, next you have to do a balance check. Here you can simply say echo your account balance that's your balance. Okay, let's create an instance. So we have three methods, we have three properties, account number, name, and balance. Then we have three methods, deposit amount, deduct amount, and check balance. Deposit amount, you pass in the amount, you basically add into the actual amount. Deduct amount, you basically check whether the balance is less than 0, then you cannot really deduct the amount. If the balance is less than equal to the actual amount that has been requested to withdraw, even you cannot do this operation, so you come out of this function, or else you basically deduct that amount from the actual balance. Okay, and check balance, you just print the balance. Okay, so let's define the bank now. The first thing you can do is you can basically set the account number. It's basically like an opening of the account, right? So you have the account number, then you can set the initial balance for that account. You can say 500, and you can set the name of that account holder. Okay, now you can start accessing those methods. So you can say check balance, Then you can actually do deposits, deposit of 500. Then you can again check the balance. Then you can deduct the amount. Deduct 100. Then you check balance again, and this time you try to deduct a bigger amount, let's say 2000, and you try to check the balance. Okay, so let's execute this program. Okay, so initially the bank account was having 500 amount, then the account balance was 1000 because you added in 500. We deducted 100, so it becomes 900. Then you try to request to deduct the amount which is greater than your actual balance, so it was not able to deduct it. Then it's actually show you the account balance. Okay, so it's very easy to formulate your bank concept into a class as well. All this is basically a mindset, right? This is like an ATM, right? You're putting your card and then you're trying to do some transactions, and all the transactions can be represented in a class, and that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to create a component of bank, and then you try to put the properties and the methods that's basically working together to stimulate an object. That's basically an ATM object could be, right? So you're trying to create a bank class and try to do the bank transaction here. Well, this is the exercise, and if you have done something similar, then that's a good job. And if you haven't really understood how this works, I highly recommend that you do this exercise. Try to figure out what are the missing pieces that you haven't understand, and try to work around with this and try to execute this program to see whether you are able to get the same output or not. Okay, so that's all the exercise on how to create a bank class, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the exercise 2. So let's do the exercise 2, which is nothing but creating a file class. So these are the exercise that you will be doing. You have to create a files class. Then you have to create two methods. First method is to display content method, which will accept a file name as an input parameter. So whatever file name is passed, you have to display the content. And you have to pass another file name to another method called getContent, which will return the content of that file. Okay, you will pass the whatever file name is passed. This method has to work accordingly with that file and try to display the content and try to fetch the data from that file. Okay, and you will pass the test.txt as an input, and then you have to call these two methods. Okay, so pause this video here and then you can do this exercise now. Okay, so let's do this exercise. So let's create files.php. Open this in Sublime. Let's create the files. So we have two methods. And getContent should return the content of the file, and file name, whatever file name we are passing, we have to fetch the content from this file name and return it. So we'll say we're going to use a string type, then we have to return the content of it. Okay, so these are the two methods that we'll creating as a part of files class. Okay, so let's implement this, then we'll create an object and call these methods. So first let's create the display content. So for that, first you have to check whether the file exists or not. So we'll use a method called file_exists, and obviously we'll pass the file name to it. And if the file doesn't exist, then we'll obviously return. We can even say a statement to say file name does not exist, so that it doesn't break the program and do a clean exit. Okay, or else we can just get the output and print them. Okay, let's implement the get content. You can even say the same thing. If file doesn't exist, return out, and this time you can store this into a variable. Okay, and then you can return the content. Okay, we have created two methods, display content and get content. Display content, we use echo statement to print the content of the file. Get content will load that into a variable and then return that content to us via the method. So let's create the instance of this class. Okay, and using this instance we will call the methods of it. So we'll say display content test.txt. Next we will write the echo content. I'll say here is file content. You can say get content. Okay, so because we say string, we have to mention double quotes. So let's execute this. Okay, so it's saying the file doesn't exist, so let's create the file. Okay, then we'll run the file. Okay, so you have the message coming in two different formats. One is printing from the method and another is fetching from the class and then printing on the echo statements. Okay, so this is so simple to understand OOP's concept here. You can convert any of the real life operations that you do into an object. Okay, and then you're doing a logical grouping of your code, and this logical grouping is basically via the methods and the properties. And once you understand how to group your code, then the major benefit you're gonna get is reusability and modularity in your code. Now you have just created, with the two exercises, we have created files and bank. If bank want to access some of the files, it depends on the files class. The files class will basically operate on the file. We have seen database class operates on the database. We have seen employee class operates on the employees. So this is how you think in objects and organize the class in methods and properties. Okay, so this is the exercise, and I hope you have done this exercise. If you have not done this exercises, it's highly recommend you do this exercise so that you understand this concept very well. Okay, so that's all this lecture on this exercise 2, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the assignment section. So I want you to do this exercise so that you can show that you have understood the concepts that has been discussed in this section. Most importantly, whether you are able to understand the OOPS language. Okay, so this is how the exercise looks like. You have to create a student class. You have to create marks as a student properties. You have to write exam result method of a student class, and this exam result method accepts 3 subject parameters, and passing marks for each exam is 35 and maximum marks is 100 for each subject. And exam results should tell whether the student is pass or fail. Okay, so you have to pass in 3 subjects, and you have to put a formula to check whether he has able to pass with minimum marks, and the maximum marks for each subject is 100. So based on this, whatever marks that you pass for that student, you should be able to calculate and say whether the student is pass or fail. Okay, so create a class that calculate this, and try to imagine how you can define the properties. You can add in the student ID, student name, just to make it easier to look. You can use your own logic to enhance it, but try to keep this core logic and do this exercise. Okay, once you do this assignment, submit it to me. I'll have a review and I'll give you my feedback. Well, that's all for this assignment. I wish you all the best, and I hope you're able to do this exercise. And if you have any questions, please put your questions onto Q&A section. I'll be there helping you to answer your questions as well. Okay, So all the best and do this exercise, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Welcome to the summary section. Let's do a summary of what you should be able to do by now. By now, you should be able to explain what is object-oriented programming and what is the purpose of using object-oriented programming in your programming style. You should understand why are you taking this course and what benefits this OOP concept will bring in your programming style. Okay, so if you should be clear by now with OOPs and what is the basics of the OOPs. You should learn what is class, object, property and methods. You should be able to define them, and you should understand the OOPs concepts using some real life examples. You should be able to write the class, object, properties and methods. This is a very important step. I hope you have done the exercises and assignments, because you have to learn how to write a class, how to define the objects. Once you understand this, then you can start learning some new concepts and implement them. Well, that's all the lecture for this section, and I'll see you in the next one.